legs, to be honest. And now I just need to mute us on YouTube. Okay, perfect. Okay, so welcome everyone to the Irish American Heritage Museum virtually, and we're delighted to have with us tonight Dr. Tyler Anbinder, who has been at the forefront of some of the most exciting work on Irish American immigration and ethnicity, wider than Irish American. He talks about immigration and ethnicity, but his kind of groundbreaking work was 5 Points, which was a history of the most notorious and infamous slum in New York City. He has written about nativism and slavery, and City of Dreams, which is a kind of a wider look at immigrant life in New York City. And tonight he's going to discuss with us the upward mobility or otherwise of immigrants, basically what happens to those Great Hunger era refugees when they come to the city. This is part of our series, the 175th commemoration of Black 47, which was ironically the worst year of the Great Hunger, even though there actually was not much blight that year. We have done a number of talks on this already, which are all available on our YouTube channel or on our webpage. And I will tell you that next month, on the 16th of November, we have Dr. Cian Riley to talk about the coffin ships and immigration at the Great Hunger. On the 6th of December, we'll have Dr. Una Walsh, who will talk about epigenetics and whether the trauma kind of and the malnourishment and everything else that accompanied the Great Hunger is still felt by Irish people in their DNA. There's a lot of work done on this epigenetics kind of trauma in Indigenous peoples and in Jewish communities. So it's just a very interesting aspect, I think, of this whole thing. And then we're delighted to finish up the series on the 14th of December with the sculptor Rowan Gillespie, who's created most of the kind of famous public memorials to Great Hunger individuals. So Dr. Anbinder teaches at George Washington University, so he's way up there. I will say he was a reader on my own doctoral dissertation, so I'm delighted to have him back in a more less stressful effort for me, even though it was a very good dissertation. So welcome, Dr. Anbinder. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Oh, and I should say too to everybody on Zoom, use the Q&A feature down here if you have a question to ask. So I'll prepare the slides now and we're good to go.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. And it's a pleasure to be virtually at the Irish American Heritage Museum. It's a great idea for an institution, and I am looking forward to coming and visiting in person one day. But today what I'll be doing is talking about the surprising social mobility of New York's famine immigrants. And the talk is titled "The Best Country in the World," which, as we'll see, is something one of the immigrants wrote in a letter back to Ireland. And so what I'll be talking about today is summing up a study that I've been working on for over a decade now that tracks several thousand immigrants who came to the United States during the Great Hunger and tracks what became of them in the United States. And the project started out as really something that I didn't have any intention of writing a book about, but the more and more I got into it, the more fascinating the stories became, and the more I just couldn't put it down. And so my intention was to start out with an article, and I have found so much good stuff that I needed to write a book. And now the truth is I have so much good stuff, I could really write 2 books if I wanted to. And it's a shame all the stuff I have to leave on the cutting room floor. Why don't we go to the next slide and I'll introduce you to the work. So this is a view of southwest County Kerry, what was known as the Lansdowne estate, because the Marquis of Lansdowne owned 3 entire parishes in the area. And this is one of them, Twosest. And 2 immigrants come to the United States among many from Twosest in this during the famine. One is named John Lane, and one is named Dennis Sullivan. They're both born here. As you can see, Twosest is very hilly, almost mountainous. We're facing away from the Bay of Kenmare, or the Kenmare River, as it's also called. But if we turned around and faced the opposite direction, we could see in the distance the river. So it's very very steep hills, mountainous. There's some sheep up there in the hillside who you can barely see. And this is a reconstructed cabin at a park there. And so these two people, John Lane and Dennis Sullivan, come from closest to the United States. They both landed in New York in 1851. They both start working as day laborers when they get to New York City. They're both in their early to mid 20s when they arrive. And if we can go to the next slide, this is the environment into which they are thrown. So just think of the contrast between those green, lovely hills and this view that they had when they arrived. John Lane moves into the building on the left, which is 31 Baxter Street. And you can see that's the big building there, the big brick building, which you can see towers over the little wooden tenements around him. And this is right at 5 Points. So the neighborhood known as 5 Points was so named because of a 5-cornered intersection. What you see here on the left is one of the kind of streets leading out of that intersection. Another street leading out of the intersection is there on the bottom right. That was named Anthony Street in 1850. Baxter's Orange Street goes up to the north. The view on the bottom there goes to the west. And Dennis Sullivan lived in that building right on the corner there in the bottom right-hand picture. And so they live, and that's catty-corner from each other. So if Lane looked out of his tall building there and he looked to the south, he would see Sullivan's building, and Sullivan would look out of his and see Lane's building. And they both start out as day laborers, but eventually their stories diverge. Sullivan lives within 1 block of that building where he first lives for the entire rest of his life, more than 30 years in New York, and he stays a day laborer the rest of his life. John Lane, on the other hand, whether it was because he had more ambition or a skill, it's hard to say, but he's not satisfied being a day laborer. He opens up a saloon, and if you go, Elizabeth, if you can point the pointer down there, nope, just point your pointer down there to the left at those little windows, left, 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 keep going left, left, more left, right there, ooh, a little to the right. There you go. That's where John Lane's saloon was, that he opens in 1855, just 5 years after he arrives in New York. He opens a saloon there, and then he, for whatever reason, we don't know, maybe he found better rents, maybe the street traffic was better. He moves to the opposite side of the street and has a saloon there. He moves to several locations on that block. And then in 1860, he moves his saloon uptown near the Hudson River docks. And not only does he move his saloon there, he actually buys a tenement up there on the west side near the Hudson River. He buys a tenement, runs a saloon in there, and then rents out the apartments in the building to other immigrants. And he makes quite a bit of money doing that. And so by the time he's on his deathbed in the 1880s, his children, a daughter, a widowed daughter, and 2 sons are anxiously awaiting his demise so that they can inherit his wealth. His daughter, as I said, is a widow, and he's got 2 ne'er-do-well alcoholic sons who fight over his money. And it's such a big mess that it actually makes headlines, the scene at his deathbed, as his kids fight over his inheritance. So if we can go to the next slide. We tend to think of the story of the famine immigrants more like Dennis Sullivan, that the immigrants came to America, and because of things like a lack of occupational training, nativism, and so forth, that they're never able to achieve very much economically, that they're kind of stuck where they are. And this is how historians have portrayed it. You can go all the way back to Oscar Handlin's book from the 1940s called Boston's Immigrants, and he portrays the famine immigrants as basically stuck where they are socioeconomically, unable to improve their lot because of a lack of training and an oversupply of labor in the port cities where the Irish settle. And more recent works tend to portray the famine immigrants the same way. The most famous is Kirby Miller's Emigrants and Exiles. It also portrays a relatively bleak picture for the famine immigrants for the same reasons: nativism, lack of job training, oversupply of labor in the port cities where the famine immigrants tend to settle. Can we go to the next slide, please? And there's lots of truth to the kinds of the ways in which these previous historians portrayed the famine immigrants. This is a column of newspaper ads from 1852, and there is you find lots of ads in this period saying no Irish need apply, and this just infuriated Irish immigrants. And for a while, there were people who doubted the extent to which no Irish need apply was really a real phenomenon. But recent scholarship using digitization of 19th century newspapers shows it was really quite prominent, much more prominent than many had believed. Can we go to the next one? And yet, the immigrants themselves don't portray their lives nearly as pessimistically as historians tend to. This is a cover of a emigrant guide, and you can see there on the bottom on the left, here's how I was coming out of my cabin, barefooted, poorly dressed. And then on the right, here's how I am in America, wearing a nice suit and tie, eating at a table with linen, having a servant serve my meals. This is the kind of upward mobility that the Irish immigrants from the famine era wrote home about. A lot of historians have said, well, the immigrants were just trying to make it look good, like they had made a good decision, and that really the reality wasn't that way. And so I decided to try to investigate that. Can we go to the next one, please? And the reason I tried to investigate that was because in finishing my book about 5 points, just before I finished that book, which came out in 2001, I discovered the opening of the Emigrant Savings Bank records. So the Emigrant Savings Bank, some of you living in New York will be familiar with it. The bank still exists today. But what you may not know is that the Emigrant Savings Bank was opened by Irish immigrants for Irish immigrants in 1850. Specifically, it was opened by an earlier generation of immigrants who had done very well, and opened in order to try to encourage the famine immigrants to save. Remember, this is a period where banks, before deposit insurance, if you put your money in a bank and the bank went bankrupt, you would lose all your money, and there was no compensation at all. And so Americans in general, and immigrants in particular, were afraid to put their money in the bank. And so the Emigrant Savings Bank's founders had an idea. They said, we're not going to invest your deposits in railroad bonds or anything like that. The only investments we'll make with your money is in safe Manhattan real estate. And that way you can know that your money is safe with us. And in fact, through several Great Depressions in which hundreds and hundreds of New York banks failed, not only did the Emigrant Savings Bank never fail, it never even missed a dividend or interest payment. And that's through the Great Depression, the Depression of 1873, the Great Recession, and so forth. Now, what makes these records so useful for the purpose of figuring out the socioeconomic mobility of the famine Irish are these ledgers. When you opened a bank account at the Emigrant Savings Bank, as you can see here on the slide, you not only had to give your name there on the left, your occupation there in the next column, your address there in the middle, but then on the right, the bank took down lots of detailed information about you for the purpose of security, right? This is a period before government issued photo ID. So if you came into the bank and wanted to take out money, the bank wanted to be able to prove that you were the person you said you were. And so what the bank did was they took down all this detailed information that you can see on the bottom of the screen there. And then if you came in and said, I'm John Boyd there, the baker, they'd say, okay, well, prove you're John Boyd. Tell us. And the information, I'll just, if you go to the very bottom line there, yeah, right there, I'll read you one because they use abbreviations. So that fellow, his name was Bartholomew O'Donnell. He's told the bank that he was a native of the city of Limerick. Do you want to follow along with your pointer there, Elizabeth? Native of the city of Limerick. And then that's their abbreviation for Ireland. Arrived New York, January 1848, per the ship Heatherbed from Limerick. And then father dead, Patrick over there. And then it has the mother's name and that she's in New York and what her name is, that there's one brother in New York whose name is John, one sister in New York whose name is Catherine, is married to Jane Riley and no children. And so if Bartholomew O'Donnell went to the bank and said, I want some money, or even if someone pretended, they would say, all right, well, if you're really Bartholomew O'Donnell, what was the name of the ship that brought you to America? And when did it arrive? And where does your father live? Aha, we caught you. He doesn't live. He's dead. You get no money. And that was what they would do. This is the first institution that we know, for example, that recorded your mother's maiden name and used that as a means to check your identity. So if we go to the next slide, this information allows us to track the famine immigrants in a way that would be impossible otherwise. Because the thing you have to keep in mind is because the Irish tend to name their kids with the same names as their parents and after the same set of saints, there are just so many people with the same name that it makes it impossible to track the famine Irish. So here's an example here of Peter Lynch. He's from County Meath. And there's his information there in the middle of the screen. He's from the townland called Rahood. Anyway, so he says in his little information there, if you go, Elizabeth, to the third line there, actually to the second line on the right, he says he has one brother in New York, James, and then on the next line, 4 sisters in New York, Anne, Jane, Mary, and Ellen. And that he's married to a different Mary McFadden. Now, so I went to, so he opens a bank account and I tried to track him. And we know when he opens his account, he works as a day laborer at a sugar refinery on the Hudson River. But then when I go to try to find what happened to him, I go to the 1860 census, there are over 100 Peter Lynches of about the same age as this one, okay? And now you could say, all right, well, we know he's married to Mary, which is true, but there are quite a few Peter Lynches who are married to Marys, as you can imagine. And then, of course, it's possible that Mary died and he had to marry somebody else, or he married nobody at all after Mary died. So, and when people have kids, then it makes it easier to track them. But someone like this Peter Lynch, it's impossible without the bank records. So amazingly enough, I had given up on this and I gave the task to the genealogist I work with, and she came up with this document on the left here, which is the 1885 Minnesota State Census of all things. And if you look down there on the bottom, she found a Peter Lynch and living with what appear to be sisters and a brother, Anne, Jane, Mary, James, and Ellen. And notice that the names all match and the order that the sisters are given is the exact same order the sisters were given in the bank records. So that made us think this might be that same Peter Lynch. And then that allowed us to go through to other records in which we could confirm that indeed the Peter Lynch who worked on the shores of the Hudson River during the 1850s, moving huge containers of raw sugar and then processed sugar around the processing plant, had by 1885, and in fact by 1860, had moved to the vicinity of Belle Plaine, Minnesota, which is southeast Minnesota, and become a farmer there. And so that's how I found Peter Lynch. And so the bank records make that possible, and it would be impossible otherwise. And so historians in the past had been able to track Irish immigrants with weird names. So one historian did that, actually it was an economist, he did that, and he found a couple of hundred people with weird names, and he was able to trace them. But most of the Irish don't have weird names, and the Irish who had weird names tended to be Protestants, which made them even less typical. So our project is the first to really be able to track common famine immigrants over the course of their lives in America. So if we go to the next slide. So I'm going to go over what we found and then tell you some of the stories involved with people like Peter Lynch. So the first thing we had to do to figure out the socioeconomic mobility of the famine Irish was to know where they started on the socioeconomic ladder when they got to America. And the impression that we get if we read the historical literature is that most of the famine immigrants who come to the United States, the men anyway, and I'm going to focus on men here, not because men are more important than women, but first, women tended not to work, and so measuring their not to work outside the home, I should say, for long periods, meaning that measuring their socioeconomic mobility is hard. Because of course, most of the famine Irish women who emigrated who were not married, they did work, they worked primarily as domestic servants, but most of them got married, and then most of them stopped working as domestic servants. And as a result, you can't really measure female socioeconomic mobility as easily. So I'm going to focus in my talk today on men. So we need to know where they start. And as I said, when you think about the famine Irish, you tend to think from reading the history that almost all of them would have been day laborers, unskilled workers when they get to America. But through the bank records and through census records, looking at people who opened bank accounts within a year of arriving in the United States, and at census records that show people who people's occupation within a year of arriving in the United States, we found that actually only a minority, although it's a big minority, 44% of the famine immigrants in New York are unskilled, have unskilled jobs like day laborer, waiter, porter, things like that. And that 56% actually have jobs that are further up the socioeconomic ladder. Now, some of them aren't very far up, further up. In this category I call petty entrepreneurs, which are peddlers of one kind or another. Though as we'll see, peddlers actually make a lot of money. But a third are artisans, things like tailors, carpenters, shoemakers. About 10% upon arrival in America are able to get jobs that I call lower status white collar. That's a clerk, and that could be a clerk in an office, that could be a clerk, a sales clerk. And then civil servants fall into that category as well. About 1 in 25% are able to come to America and immediately open a business. And then a tiny number, less than 1 in 100, are doctors and lawyers and such when they arrive in America. Now, if we go to the next slide, then using the bank records and census records, we can see, all right, what happens 10 years after they arrive? And if you compare the center column there with the right column, you can see that a good amount of change happens in those first 10 years in America. The percentage of unskilled goes down pretty significantly. The proportion of artisans stays about the same. Proportion of lower status white collar stays the same. But look at that big change in the business owners, right? That goes from only 5% to 17%. And so what you can see there is already, even within 10 years of arrival in America, a lot of even the famine Irish, who are, the poorest immigrants ever to arrive in the United States to that point, a lot of them have moved already into business ownership. Now, you might say, looking at these columns, well, it's all the unskilled who are moving into business ownership, and none of the other groups really are. But as I'll show you when I break down the numbers a little bit more in a few minutes, that's not actually the case. Now, if we go to the next slide, this slide compares the occupation within a year of arrival with the final known occupation of the more than 1,000 male famine immigrants who I tracked. And so, as you can see here, the change is quite profound, right? You go from 44% unskilled to only a quarter unskilled. If we skip up to towards the top, the business ownership ranks have mushroomed from 5% of the total to nearly a third of the total. And the number who are petty entrepreneurs, hucksters, and peddlers has gone down also. And notice even the number of artisans has gone down. And that's primarily because a lot of those artisans became business owners. So let's go to the next slide and look at exactly how people were moving up the ladder. So this shows what becomes of the unskilled workers, that group that started out unskilled at the beginning within a year of arrival, and then comparing them to the final, looking at those individuals' final occupations, okay? And so you can see nearly 6 in 10 stay in an unskilled occupation, but 41% of the people who start out in an unskilled occupation move up. And as you can see, most of that movement is up into the business ownership category. So that's a pretty high climb up the socioeconomic ladder, right? Some are only moving up as far as becoming peddlers. Some have gained artisanal skills. Some have moved into lower status white collar ranks. A couple even become lawyers, but most are becoming business owners. And that fellow I have down there on the bottom right, that's a porter. We'll talk about porters was one of the most popular unskilled jobs. Can we go to the next slide? One of the important things to realize, and that I look at in the book, is that even if you stayed in the unskilled ranks, you could move, and the Famine Irish often did, from the relatively low pay, low prestige job like day laborer to the higher paying occupations that still would be considered unskilled, but pay much better. One of those was to be a porter. So porters, for instance, if you became a porter, that's a more entrepreneurial kind of job. So a day laborer goes to a construction site, typically gets $1 a day in the famine era. A porter, however, the amount of money they earn depends on how hard they hustle, right? A porter would work at a ferry terminal, at a train station, maybe at a market offering to carry people's things. Porters could also work in stores, but typically you'd work at one of those other places. And so a porter's pay was based on how hard they hustled, how long the hours were that they worked, how well they ingratiated themselves with their customers to earn tips. And so porters, and we know this looking at the savings bank records, porters were able to save on average 40% more than day laborers. And then the picture I have here, this is a cartman. Cartman was another unskilled job, but if you saved up enough money, you could buy a horse and a cart and become a cartman, and you still don't have any job skills. You could be illiterate and be a cartman, but cartmen earn even more money than porters because you can, as you can see here, this guy's hauling a load of wood. You can haul items that earn you more money. And so porters save 40% more than day laborers, and cartmen save 30% more than those porters. And so you could do quite well as a cartman. And so even if you stayed within the ranks of the unskilled, that doesn't mean you hadn't necessarily moved up within your occupational category. Can we go to the next slide? So let's talk about peddlers. So as you saw, I had peddlers one rung up the socioeconomic ladder from the unskilled. And as you can see, peddlers had a very hard life. We've got here on the left, a hat peddler. He's selling used hats. On the right, we have an umbrella dealer. The umbrella dealer is most likely peddling umbrellas that he himself makes. That was typical for umbrella peddlers. On sunny days, you sat in your tenement and you made umbrellas. And then on the rainy days, like this fellow did, you went out on the street and sold them to desperate pedestrians who wanted to try to stay dry. So one of the interesting things about peddling is it was an occupation that people looked down upon. The people had to be out on the streets all the time in terrible weather. Often they had to tramp out of the city to sell their goods. They were also known for shady dealings, for not being completely honest about their goods. So people didn't hold them in high esteem. However, the peddlers got the last laugh all the way to the bank because peddlers we know from the bank records, saved a lot of money. Not only did they save more than all the unskilled workers, they save on average double what even the artisans save, and double and 50% more than even what the lower status white collar workers save. And so peddlers in their earnings, they save, or in their savings, save about as much as your typical brick and mortar business owner. The only brick and mortar business owners who saved more than peddlers were saloon keepers. So the Irish were very clever, astute peddlers, right? The whole idea behind peddling is buy low and sell high. And so it was a risky business in the sense that, you know, as a day laborer, you show up at a construction site, you know, you'll go home at the end of the day with $1. A peddler might come home with nothing at the end of the day, right? Especially if you're an umbrella peddler. But you also might, you know, if there's a huge thunderstorm, it rains all day, you might come home with $10 or $20, right? So it was a boom and bust kind of thing. But if you could kind of, if you were a skillful entrepreneur, the bank records show that peddlers made a lot of money. If we go to the next slide. So higher up on my socioeconomic ladder that I've drawn for you are the artisans, the tradesmen. So this is a great photo of Lower Manhattan near the Hudson River that shows on the left a print shop, in the center there a carpenter shop, and on the right a painting business. So one thing that's important to keep in mind, and that this photo well illustrates, is that within, say, printing or carpentry, you have more than one kind of person. You would have the master carpenter or master printer. That's the person who owns a printing or carpentry business, right? So Mr. Croker here on the left owns his printing business. He might never actually get his hands dirty with ink in front of a printer. And then Mr. Colt, it looks like, on the in the middle there with his carpentry business. Again, he may not handle any saw and nails. Instead, the people who do that are what are known as the journeymen. The journeyman tradesmen are people who are printers or carpenters but don't own their own business. They work for wages for a master. So if you look in the dead center of the picture there, if you, Elizabeth, go right to that guy standing in the doorway, right there, exactly. And he's got that funny kind of cap on his head there. That is your quintessential journeyman's cap. And then he's got his apron there that also shows he's a worker. So that's your journeyman carpenter there. He's upstairs doing the hard work of the carpentry business, maybe sawing the boards to the right size, maybe putting together bookshelves or whatever. Whereas down at the bottom there, you know, it could be that fellow with the top hat there on the left, who actually is Mr. Peak. Oh, that's the drug broker. Oh, so that building actually, I see, that has a drugstore on the bottom and a carpentry shop on top. But yeah, so somebody up there may be the Mr. Outcult who owns the carpentry business, and the fellow in the middle there might be his journeyman. And that makes it difficult for what I'm doing, trying to track people's upward mobility, upward or downward, right? Because if you come to America trained as a carpenter and you say when you report to the census taker, I'm still a carpenter, that could mean that you're a journeyman carpenter working for wages, or it could mean that you own a carpentry business or a printing business like Mr. Croker. And that's the kind of thing that's difficult to determine. I use city directories to do that, because in the city directory, if you're listed as a printer but have no business address, then we can be pretty sure you're a journeyman. But if you're listed as a printer and you're listed as having a business address where your printing business is located, then we can be pretty sure you're a master and a business owner. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that with skilled workers, there is some downward mobility. Some people fail as, say, journeymen and will end up in the ranks of the unskilled. Although what I found is sometimes that was a journeyman who worked in a very poor paying trade, like, say, tailor. who might decide, I can make a lot more money as a porter hustling business at a ferry terminal than I can as a tailor sitting all day over a sewing machine. So what can appear to be downward mobility isn't necessarily experienced as such. And then, as you can see, for every person who has downward mobility as a skilled worker, there are 5 who move up. And they mostly move up into the business owner categories. That's someone who starts out as a journeyman, who ends up owning their own business, a shoemaker who becomes a shoe store owner, and so forth. If we go to the next one, great. So the next category up the ladder there you see is what I call the lower status white collar workers. Recall those are clerks, salesmen, agents, and civil servants. Now that group, actually, you can see there, has the most upward mobility. Even though they start fairly high up the ladder, they have the most upward mobility of any group, right? More than half, even though they're fairly high up to begin with, more than half of them move higher still. Now, keep in mind, this is not a huge group, right? Only about 10% of the famine immigrants start out as lower status white collar workers. In part, that's because those jobs required a decent education. You had to know how to read and write. For most of them, you had to know some math as well. And so only about 10% start out in that category. But as you can see, half of those people move up, and the vast majority of those people who are moving up move up to the ranks of the business owner. And what you find is that a lot of the famine immigrants, even some who come to the United States with enough money to start their own business, many of them choose not to, and to initially start out as a clerk and work in a New York business and learn the ropes, learn how business works in New York, how it differs from business in Ireland. And that way, once they were going to risk their capital in starting their own business, they would know the basic operations of New York businesses, how to deal with the city government when necessary, and be more likely to succeed. And then, as you can also see, though, a significant number of the lower status white collar workers move up into the professions, which is doctors and lawyers. And in this case, these are mostly lawyers, people who start out as clerks. And that would be, in this case, mostly as law clerks. You'd work for someone who is already an attorney. You'd clerk for them. That was usually how you then learned law, by reading law while you clerked for an attorney. That lawyer would then sponsor you for the bar exam. And then once you passed the bar exam, you could become a lawyer yourself. Let's go to the next slide. So here are some of the people in the ranks of the lower status white collar workers who I talk about in my book. On the left, you have there James Kavanaugh. He actually starts out in New York as a carpenter, but he volunteers his time while he's a carpenter during the 1850s as an officer in the all-Irish 69th Regiment, which was a militia unit, but today we'd call the National Guard. And the National Guard existed then, like now, to be ready in case of war, to volunteer for service. And so when the Civil War started, the federal government called the 69th Regiment, mobilized the 69th Regiment, and Kavanaugh went with the regiment down to Virginia and fought in the Civil War. And he's there from the very beginning at Bull Run. And the 69th, which was known even then as the Fighting 69th, saw action in all of the major battles of the Virginia campaign, not just Bull Run, but some of the worst, like Fredericksburg and Antietam and Gettysburg. And Kavanaugh ends up as one of the highest ranking officers in the unit. After the war, though, he comes back to New York and he goes back to his daily life as a carpenter. But he was well known in the Irish community, and Irish American politicians wanted to reward Kavanaugh as he got older and was kind of too old to be a carpenter anymore. And so they rewarded him by giving him a patronage job for the Custom House. This was in Brooklyn. And so this was one way in which you got a lower status white collar job. Sometimes it was a reward for meritorious service to your party, or in Kavanaugh's case, to the government during the Civil War. In the middle there, we have John Mara. He also fought in the Civil War, but he was not an officer. And after the war, he comes back to New York and becomes a police officer. And he rose through the ranks until he became, by 1900, a captain, also in Brooklyn. One of the most interesting stories is this fellow on the right. And those two pictures on the right are the same fellow, Captain Thomas D. Norris. On the top is a picture of him as a Civil War soldier. At the bottom is his image later in life, near the time of his death in the 1880s. Norris's story is really interesting. He comes to America already trained as a tailor. He opens his own clothing shop in Lower Manhattan before the Civil War. When the Civil War starts, he stays in New York for the first year, but then he feels kind of guilty, apparently. And he's doing fairly well as a business owner. And so he leaves his wife and children and goes and actually spends all of his hard-earned money to raise a regiment or a company of soldiers to fight in the Irish Brigade. He manages to survive. He comes back at the end of the war, but is heartbroken to find that his wife has run off with another man. And so he sues for divorce. He's granted custody of his children, but he tries to open another business. This time he tries to open a saloon, but the saloon is a failure, and he sinks all his money into the saloon. So he's penniless now with 3 children to support. And so by the late 1860s, he's literally selling apples in Lower Manhattan in front of Castle Garden to incoming immigrants, hoping to earn a penny an apple and support his family. And he's doing very poorly in the late 1860s into the early 1870s. He moves out of Manhattan into Westchester County to what's now the Bronx to save money because it's much cheaper to live there. He tries to become a real estate agent. That doesn't go very well. And he ends up, his luck turns, ironically, when he gets arrested. He's arrested one day in the early 1870s for buying untaxed cigars. So he's found a peddler who's selling cigars on which the excise tax hasn't been paid. And that would, if you're a poor person like Norris was, that would be what you do. You would try to find a cigar seller who had smuggled some cigars into the city and hadn't paid the tax on it. And he's arrested for buying these cigars. And when he's brought before the judge, he pleads for leniency, and he tells his story about having sold his business, put all the money into his Civil War regimental company, coming back, he's been betrayed by his wife, he's impoverished, and he asks for leniency. And 2 New York newspapers print his story. And the story catches the eye of some local politicians who say, we should do something for this fine Irish immigrant. And so they arranged for him to get a clerkship with the city government, with one of the courts down on Center Street. And so he gets this clerk's job, and he goes from being impoverished to now having a pretty high salary as a clerk. And he continues in these clerkships of one kind or another, and the offices would turn over, and the mayor would leave office, another one would come in, and they'd fire all the clerks. But when that would happen to Norris, the Irish American newspapers would complain, how can you fire this guy who gave so much for his country? And he would get reinstated. And so he holds these clerkships, one kind or another, for the last 20 years of his life, and ends up in fine financial shape after having suffered that hardship in the middle of his life. Can we go to the next slide? So Norris, of course, was at one point a business owner. Rather than look at business owners the way we have been with the other groups, what happens to them, I thought here I'd show you the origins of the business owners. So here's looking on the left at the first known occupation of those who end their lives as business owners. So as you can see, only about 1/5 of the people who end their lives as business owners in New York start out as business owners among the famine immigrants. That in fact, more come from the ranks of the unskilled than any other, but many come from the ranks of the artisans. Peddlers become business owners too. And that's actually a pretty big percentage, 5% of them being business owners, since the number of peddlers was so small to begin with. And so as you can see, the ranks of the famine Irish business owners in New York are actually quite varied in terms of their origin. And if we go to the next slide, so I thought I would just tell you some of the quickly some of the stories of these business owners. Some have businesses that you could imagine they would go into. So on the upper left there, I have an advertisement for William Doherty, who is a carriage maker. He works for decades in New York. He actually apprenticed as a carriage trimmer, someone who decorates carriages and does kind of the fine detail work on carriages in Ireland. His brother-in-law, who is a carriage maker, trained him. And then he comes to America and works as a carriage trimmer in various Manhattan carriage shops for several decades before late in life buying the carriage shop of a fellow in Westchester, again, what's now the part that's now the Bronx, in what's now kind of the Throgs Neck neighborhood, and buys a carriage shop and becomes a carriage shop owner himself. That's a typical route for many people into business, starting out as a journeyman for many years. Then we have people like the Morgan brothers, who are shown there on the right, whose story is very different. The three Morgan brothers moved to New York in the late 1840s, and they start out in lowly jobs, day labor, working in a stable as a stable hand. And two of these brothers lodged with a guy who made soda pop, and several of the soda makers soda pop makers lodged with the brothers. Somehow through that connection, the brothers learned how to make sarsaparilla, ginger beer, things like that, ginger ale, and started making their own soda. And through that, they became soda makers. And so you can see there on the bottom left, as Elizabeth is indicating, they eventually open a soda business and they drive a cart similar to this one around town, stopping at saloons and restaurants and selling their soda. And I went, let's see if I have it here. Yes. So come over here. I found a collector last year who collects these things, and this is actually a Morgan Brothers soda bottle. So one thing you notice here is this holds about 4 ounces. That was the serving size back then. So if we think about how serving sizes have changed, 4 ounces, that was your soda bottle. And so this actually says on it Morgan Brothers, and it has their address, 145 West 35th Street. And so this is one of my favorite possessions. I love that. So they start out in that, but to show you the way in which these famine immigrants had ambition, they have a thriving soda business. But what did they decide? You know, we have enough time, we can run 2 businesses. So they decide as a kind of side hustle to open, if you want to indicate on the upper right there, they open a moving and storage business also. They decide to leave the soda business to one of the 3 brothers, and the other 2 brothers start this moving business. The moving business still exists in Manhattan today. And that becomes their main business, and they were smart, right? So you think about it, they were smart businessmen. They had a hedge, you know, and they were able to survive. Although the soda business in a way survived as well, because so the son of the remaining Morgan brother who ran the soda business, he continued the business into the 20th century and eventually merged it with a Minnesota soda business called White Rock. And so any of you older folks out there in the audience who lived in Manhattan might remember White Rock soda, which it's still a brand that still exists. It's hard to find these days with the Coke and Pepsi duopoly, but the brand still exists. So both these businesses in one form or another still exist, started by these 3 Morgan brothers. You want to go to the next slide? Another business story I love is the Phelan and Collender Billiard Table Company. So up on the right there is Mr. Phelan. He comes to New York before the famine with his father. And he starts out as he's apprenticed to a jeweler, but he loves playing billiards. And he's kind of a billiard fanatic. He plays constantly every free minute he gets. And he becomes one of the best billiard players in America. But as perhaps you can imagine with someone who hangs out way too much in pool halls, he's a bit of a ne'er-do-well. He's terrible with money. He actually makes a lot of money winning prizes in pool games, but then he squanders it on business ventures that he's poor at operating. He becomes lucky in a sense, though, because his 16-year-old daughter falls in love with a more recent immigrant, a famine immigrant named Collender, who had actually been fled Ireland in 1849 after participating in the failed uprising of 1848, comes to America. He falls in love with 16-year-old Phelan's daughter, gets her pregnant. They get married when she's 16, baby's born when she's 17. And so the Phelans and the Collenders are living together under the same roof because young Collender's just arrived in America. He hasn't done much with himself. He's working as a sash and blind maker. It must be a very crowded little household that they live in. But Collender hears Phelan complain all the time about the poor quality of the pool tables, billiard tables he plays on. He says, they don't have good caroms. I have perfect aim, and yet when I shoot the ball off the cushion, the ball doesn't go where it should. And he says, I have all these great ideas for creating these great cushions that would make pool much more precise and much more enjoyable. And he says, but I've gone to these various billiard table makers, and they all say, oh, your ideas are way too expensive. We want cheap tables, not good tables. So Collender, who has no experience with billiard tables, but clearly a clever guy, takes Phelan's ideas and with his assistant patents them. And then he's also a better salesman, and he goes and he finds an Irish-American pool table manufacturer who makes who agrees to try Phelan's cushion and pocket designs. And the tables become very popular, so much so that Phelan and Collender buy out the other billiard table maker and start their own company, which they call Phelan and Collender. And one of the things they design is this table on the bottom here that has sides that are beveled, so it doesn't take up quite so much space in your room. Because pool tables then were huge. They were 12 feet long and 6 feet wide. So that beveling made the tables feel smaller, and they became hugely popular. So much so that they built this, eventually in the 1870s, built this factory, which took up almost an entire city block on Manhattan's West Side. And they soon outgrew that and had to build an even bigger factory in Connecticut. And so Phelan and Collender become super rich with their pool tables, all from the business acumen of Collender, because Phelan just collects the money and then squanders the money. And then Phelan dies, and his family sues Collender because they say, we can't have this little money left. You must have cheated us. And they go to trial, and Collender proves that no, Phelan got all his money. He just squandered it. So, and then Collender's company the company is so successful after Phelan's death that they buy the Brunswick company. But they decide that the Brunswick name is a little more classy than the Collender, so they go by the name Brunswick. And so, of course, you can still buy Brunswick pool tables today. So another famine Irish business that continues to this day. Do you want to go to the next slide as we wrap up here? Now, of course, being a business owner, I've given you some successful businesses. There were lots of more precarious businesses. I just show quickly two of them here. One was running lodging houses. That was a very popular business for famine immigrants, especially women. Women often ran the businesses. And as you could see, the overhead was very low. This lodging house that's shown here on the left, that's just a tenement apartment. So that's a 12 by 12 foot room in which the person running the lodging house just crams as many beds as possible into that 12 by 12 foot room. and then charges people, 5 cents a night to sleep in the bed, and you don't necessarily get the whole bed. On the upper right there, that's the entrance to a junk shop. Those were also very popular among famine immigrants. And so lodging houses could go for anywhere from small things like this single room to successful ones who would rent entire tenement buildings and fill the entire building with lodgers. And junk businesses, again, could go from very small and making very little money to doing quite well. Can we get the next slide? Now, the pinnacle of the business ownership for the famine Irish community was to be a saloon keeper. And the bank records bear this out. Saloon keepers saved more money in their bank accounts than any other kind of business owner. The only groups that saved more money than saloon keepers were doctors and lawyers. Saloon keeping, though, was not a sure thing. The emigrant bank records have saloon keepers who do very well, who make literal fortunes as saloon keepers, and people who fail, sometimes because they give away too many free drinks, sometimes because, part of the thing of becoming a successful saloon was being a place people wanted to go. And if the saloon keeper was not known as a nice fellow, people would not go to the saloon. So most people succeed at saloon keeping, but some people fail as well. Next slide. One last thing to mention is not all famine immigrants who live in New York stay in New York. Probably about a third of them eventually leave for other places. Now, the most interesting thing in this regard is that nearly half the people who leave New York only go so far as Brooklyn, which then was a separate city from New York. The next most popular place to go was New Jersey. And we're not talking about central New Jersey, we're talking about Jersey City, Hoboken, Newark. So not very far at all. But then one of the interesting things, if you look at where the New York famine Irish moved to if they left the New York metropolitan area, the second most popular state other than New York to move to after New Jersey was California. So the famine immigrants are quite mobile. As you can see, not very many go to the South. A good number go to the Midwest and become farmers. And then a lot go to California because if you were ambitious and you were entrepreneurial, California was known as the place where you had the most possibility of succeeding and the most wealth to be made. And I talk in the last chapter of my book about the fact that that's borne out by a lot of stories of famine immigrants who go there and start with nothing and end up quite wealthy. And those stories made it back to New York and attracted more immigrants later on. So can we go to the final slide? So this is a scene of the Emigrant Savings Bank, the source of the records that made my story possible in 1880. So that's a generation after the famine immigrants arrive. And you can see here amongst the people, and this is 1880 at the time of another famine that strikes Ireland in 1879 and continues into 1880. And so this scene is of New York Irish Americans going to the bank and withdrawing money to send to loved ones in Ireland. And they're able to do so because they had experienced quite a bit of socioeconomic success and upward mobility. And that even those who didn't experience that much upward mobility on the socioeconomic ladder still saved a surprising amount of money and had enough money to put their kids through college. And that's what we see when we look at the kids of the famine generation. The saloon keepers' kids tend to go to college and become doctors and lawyers or priests. It's interesting. The two most popular occupations among the saloon keepers' kids who go to college are lawyer and priest. And of course, not everybody's kids move up. We have John Lane, who we started with. He was a successful saloon keeper and tenement owner, and his kids went in and out of jail their entire lives. And we know most about John Lane's kids because of the Sing Sing prison records, because that's where they tended to be quite a bit, both of them. even after they inherited their portion of their father's savings. So what we learned from the famine Irish is that or I guess what I'd say is my conclusion about the famine Irish is that they are the immigrants in the American story who prove that anyone can prosper in America, because they arrive in America more impoverished, less skilled, less educated than any immigrant ever to arrive in the United States. And a lot of the native-born Americans, when the famine Irish arrived, said, these people can never succeed as Americans because they don't have the skills necessary to be successful in America. But a lot of people, both Irish Americans and non-Irish Americans, said, no, that's wrong. Anybody can succeed in America with hard work, with some luck, with intelligence. And the famine Irish proved that right. Their bank accounts prove that, and their socioeconomic mobility proves that as well. So that's my talk. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'd be happy to take questions now.
Well, that was fantastic. So those of you who are online, both on YouTube and on Zoom, the Zoom people can use this Q&A feature here. Just type a question and I'll call it out, or the chat, whichever is easier for you. I took copious notes. So I have lots. First of all, I want to say, you know, it's amazing research, Dr. Anbinder, that you've done. And it's fabulous to put like names and sometimes faces with these people, because we do have this image, I think, of, you know, the huddling masses. I read somewhere, you know, that the average life expectancy was 7 years. So you kind of think that this is a lost generation, you know, the people get off the boat practically naked and then they die. So to see that that is not true. And what I loved about your presentation too is none of those, like the simian featured, you know, cartoons that were kind of prevalent at the time. So, you know, there is a thriving Irish American or Irish immigrant community, which is lovely to see portrayed. One of my questions, I suppose, and you kind of touched on it later on with Norris, the political jobs, or those patronage jobs that Irish become so famous for, I suppose a little bit later, you know, during the Tammany Hall era, are not jobs until, you know, certainly firemen are not professionalized, I think, until the 1860s. So do you think, what does that do as a category when, you know, people start going into becoming ward leaders or assembly members and that kind of thing? It's not this generation, it's the next generation, must be.
Right. So the police, a police officer is a job that's already semi-professionalized, I guess you would say, by the time the famine Irish arrive, and more so by the late 1850s. And a lot of Irish immigrants become policemen, and the bank records show us why that was such a popular job. The average policeman actually saved in their bank accounts as much money as the average saloon keeper, which shows you, and we don't know exactly why that is, because the salary wasn't that high. But even like today, you could moonlight and do private security work in your spare time. Yeah. Also, in those days, what I found was really interesting. If say your house was burgled and the police came, you would often, it was a common thing to pay a New York City detective on the side because they would say, well, there's nothing we can do. We don't have the manpower. But if you paid the detective in their spare time, they would go look into your crime. Nice. And that was a way you earned extra money. And yeah.
Wow.
And
I mean, obviously corruption was rife. We hate to say it, you know, but the Lexow commission that happens later on, they are, you know, getting a lot of backhanders, I suppose, or shaking down, you know, brothels and things like that.
Right. And the interesting question is, so you see that talked about all the time from kind of the 1880s onward, and you don't see that discussed much in the famine era. And so the question is that because it wasn't happening, or because it was so pervasive that that it was just hush hush and no one talked about it? And we don't know for sure. And I tend to think that if this was common, it would have been talked about, because the Irish had so many critics that people would have leaped at that if they thought it was something worth leaping at. So, so my guess is there's more of this other kind of work that you can do.
So, right, that's one of my questions. Politicians, it's interesting, the records to take the mother's maiden name, you know, because particularly, I mean, even as you said, the women come, you know, they might work as a maid. A lot of the times women are kind of almost anonymous. So it's amazing to hear. And of course, the mother is at home in Ireland or she's dead, but to get those records is, you know, fantastic, I think.
Yes. And I have, you know, since my focus has been on socioeconomic mobility, I've looked more at the men than the women, but, you know, the databases I've made for this project, which are posted online and easy to find, have hundreds and hundreds of women who some enterprising historian or historians could, you know, make a lot of the bank records as they, you know, what they tell us about women. It's a little harder to track the women. You know, there's great source on domestics. It's just hard to know what happens to the domestics after they get married.
Yeah. And I'm thinking then about Timothy Guilfoyle and what's the woman historian, City of Eros, name escapes me. But like it maybe the prostitution thing, you know, I assume those women are saving money, but they mightn't be able to declare their job, you know, so that's an interesting one too.
Well, they had euphemisms for those jobs. So
right,
I talk in the book, I talk about brothel keepers, some of whom were women. And, you know, they'll say that they run a lodging house or a saloon.
It's Christine Stansted, I've just remembered her name.
Right.
So David has asked, do we know what percentage of the famine immigrants were literate? Were some able to become literate in the US? And how did literacy affect their upward mobility? Literacy.
So we do know, and what we know is for the men, more than half of the men are literate, and for the women, almost half are literate.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that that's a much higher percentage than of the Irish population in Ireland overall that we get through the census records in Ireland. And so what that indicates, and it's a really important thing for people to remember when they think about the famine Irish, is the famine immigrants were not the poorest of the Irish. They were not even a cross section of the Irish. They were really a group that was better than average Irish, because the fact that so many more famine immigrants in New York were literate than were all Irish shows that, and this was talked about in Ireland all the time. The people in Ireland said, you know, the educated people are leaving and the poorest of the poor stay because they can't afford to leave. And that was often the case. So right. So we know that, to get back to the question, that, you know, it's something like 65% of the men. I actually, if the reader's interested, if you Google my name and the American Historical Review, I have an article that appeared a couple of years ago, and I have the exact statistics in there. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's as I said, about 65% of the men are literate, 40-something% of the women are literate, and that's it's lower than native-born Americans. It's higher though than the Irish population on the eve of the famine.
Oh, sorry, lower than Americans, you said. Okay, yeah, that is interesting. I might be able to link the article when we put this up on, you know, YouTube. So Brian said, you mentioned the two men from Tusist, which is fun to hear because it's a family place they've visited several times in the past 6 years. Do you track where others have come from in addition to where they've gone? So I know your work on the Lansdowne estate, absolutely, you were able to track a load of them.
Right. So through the bank records, I know where pretty much every person who I talk about in the book, exactly where they come from, because the bank, again, for security purposes, they don't just write down that you're from Ireland. They don't just write down what county you're from, but they write down the parish and even the townland that you're from. So I know with great detail. And that same American Historical Review piece that I just mentioned, I do a lot of mapping to show exactly where the famine immigrants come from.
And then are you able to track them here? you know, once they've landed,
Yes.
yeah, okay.
Yes, and so that's one of the things you find is that there's a lot of networking going on. So that has a number of features. So for example, there's one place on the Dingle Peninsula called Castle Gregory. And for some reason, and it's only got 500 people on the eve of the famine, but a lot of them come to New York. And when they come to New York, pretty much all the men start working in the gas works, which is a place where it's a terrible job. You're shoveling coal all day into these huge furnaces that burn at incredibly high temperatures to create the gas that lights the street lights in New York. And the Castle Gregory men all go into the gas works. It's a terrible job, so you don't stay very long, and then they leave, and then you see they go certain places. So there's a large number of these Castle Gregory gasworks men who end up in, for some reason, Greencastle, Indiana.
Wow.
Work on the railroad and in a nail factory there. So the place you come from not only determines sometimes the job you have in New York, but also where you end up once you leave New York, if you decide to do that.
Yeah, well, I was very struck by your first article that From Famine to 5 Points talked about almost recreating the village, like that everyone practically from Kenmare, you know, lived within a block almost of each other in 5 Points. And then the latest article talks about, you know, if someone was already out here and you had that kind of chain migration, that someone could help you with a foot, you know, on a ladder or that kind of thing. So it's interesting that those ties are incredibly important, you know, for these immigrants. Christopher says, to follow on David's question, do we know what percentage of the immigrants were native English speakers? I mean, most of them, I guess, weren't they, Dr. Anbinder?
Right. So we don't know that as well as we know these other things. The bank would once in a while say about a depositor speaks no English.
Yeah.
They don't say that very often, which implies that most of the immigrants had some English.
Yeah.
But how good their English was, we don't know.
Yeah. And they may not have been literate in English, even if they could speak it,
correct.
You know. Yeah. Yeah.
Correct. Right. Right. So we know there's a lot of illiteracy, even for people who could speak English. But yeah,
but like that's a very nuanced.
Well.
Yeah, because, you know, the penal laws in Ireland had more or less forbidden, you know, education, but also the speaking of Irish. But then they called it the National Education Act. The primary school education was kind of established in Ireland in the 1830s before it was in England, so that they would make good British citizens out of Irish peasants, you know. And so English was the taught language, you know. It was Irish was dying, and certainly after the famine, you know, absolutely was in huge. But again, that's probably because more of those Irish speakers died as opposed to immigrating, because they would have been the poorest of the poor. Right. Brian says, thank you. So, go ahead, sorry.
One thing we don't know is a lot of the places where the least English was spoken in Ireland don't send many immigrants to America. Yeah. But what we don't know is that because they were so poor and isolated, or because they didn't think they would have a chance to do well in America not speaking English. Yeah. On the other hand, you know, Southwest Kerry, also a lot of non-English speakers, and there's a lot of emigration to America from there. So it's hard to know why some places send a lot of people to America who don't speak English and other places don't.
And I'd hazard that in Kerry, particularly Kenmare, as opposed to maybe Dingle, which today still is a Gaeltacht area, or, you know, an Irish-speaking area, were bilingual. You know, so they probably did speak Irish, but they also could speak English, you know.
Right.
It's interesting though. Brian says, thank you so much. I've been talking with his sociology classes about this type of immigrant networking, and it has also been a keen insight for people doing family history research. Yeah, it is. So I will definitely try and link your article from the American Historical Review somehow, so that you guys can check it out. It was interesting to see the beards are back in fashion, like Norris's younger picture. And, you know, I had written down, oh yes, the last thing I wanted to talk to you about was why do we think, or I had just written down, do we think they managed to save, particularly among those lower, we'll call them technically lower income brackets and the less skilled, because the living conditions were so horrific? Like, so are they crammed into, tenements and 5 points together and paying, to share rooms. So is that why they're spending money? I know in your original article you were saying the Irish could afford to leave. Some of them had $300 in the bank, but they are not leaving 5 points because potentially, something could always go wrong. A husband could lose a hand, at work, or he could desert you, and so there's this idea that they were kind of saving for rainy days rather than for a better immediate lifestyle or conditions.
So I think they're saving for both rainy days as a safety net, and so they can, if they want someday, start a business
eventually.
So I wouldn't. The way I would put it is that having lived through the famine and having seen what happens when you have no savings to help you during a crisis, that the famine Irish were so scarred by that they became obsessive savers and obsessively frugal. I talk in the article you're mentioning that you're going to post about this one saloon keeper. He works his first 10 years in New York as a gardener. And then he opens a saloon in northern Manhattan, north of Harlem. And he lives, people don't think he's making that much money because he dresses very simply. He lives very simply. His apartment is tiny for someone who's a saloon keeper. He can afford more. He has hardly any possessions. He dies, and the executor of his will opens his safe. He has this tiny little desk. It's like, it's just like this big, like maybe the kind of thing you might find in a cheap hotel that's just barely big enough to fit your cell phone and maybe your passport, that size safe. So not a big safe, tiny little thing. And they open it up and it's stacked to the brim with bank passbooks. So you'd have to be the older people in the audience to remember what a bank passbook looks like. That's where the bank recorded your deposits and withdrawals. He had 20 of them in there, and he had a fortune in these banks. Wow. But he never spent any money on himself. He dressed terribly. He had nothing in his house. He ate simply. He was one of the many, many obsessive savers who thought, well, I'm not going to let that happen to me again. So I'm going to save and save and save. And if something terrible happens again, I'll be protected. And a lot of the famine immigrants did this. They didn't buy nicer clothes when they could afford to do so. They didn't move into more expensive neighborhoods when they could afford to do so. They didn't eat more expensive cuts of meat when they could afford to do so, because they had been so scarred by the famine. And looking at their more well-to-do neighbors who could afford to buy bread and they couldn't, and they couldn't feed their children. And so they're determined never to let that happen again.
I'm not surprised. Christopher asked, the migration across the US was very interesting. Yeah, it was a high percentage to go to California. Did you see any evidence of successful immigrants returning to Ireland?
So that's a great question. And it's of all the things that I'm doing in the project, the one I have the most trouble figuring out.
Yeah.
Because so if you went, and this tells you something about the way Ireland was treated by the British, is, if an Irish immigrant moved to England, I can find them usually through the extant English census records. But if you move back to Ireland, unless you had a very unusual name, and you're in one of the counties and parishes whose church records survived and have been put online, it's really hard to find. So I do know about people who moved back there. One of my favorite examples, but it clearly can't be the typical example. There's a guy who comes to America. He becomes a successful contractor, so builder. One of the contracts he gets is to build the first part of the Long Island Railroad. So obviously a huge job that makes him quite rich. That he takes his wealth and he goes back to Ireland. He buys the castle in his native parish that had been, when he was a boy, lived in by, well, not much lived in, but owned by the absentee landlord. And he goes back to England and he buys the castle and he lives out his days there. So
that's lovely, revenge fantasy.
So there's extreme examples like that. There are other people we know, I know about, but they're few and far between. And they tend to be someone with an unusual name, and therefore I imagine it must be more common, and I just can't track it. But
yeah,
the extent to which it happens is hard to know.
Yeah, and I remember, again, I don't know where I read it, but the Jewish community are the only community with a lower repatriation rate, like it's 2% or something, and the Irish at 3%. So it is very rare, really, for Irish people to return, I guess particularly in the 19th century. There is an article called, I'm almost positive it's called The Fanula Factor. I must look for it, which was a little bit later, like very early 20th century. And they talked about, it was mostly women immigrants, going and coming. And a lot of them, had worked as maids, were able to go back, and now they could marry who they wanted, or they could open a store at home in Ireland. But some of them, once they got back, decided, to hell with this, I'm going back to America, because they were kind of more modernized, so Singh, the poet or the playwright, recorded meeting two sisters in Kerry, and one was, covered by the shawl and barefoot and wouldn't meet his eye, and the other girl was very chatty and outgoing on the train in Kerry, and she was like, I've had it, I can't live like this, I got to go back. So it's very interesting, I think, that it was difficult probably to repatriate, even emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
So if there are no other questions, this was fantastic. I will try to link all of these articles. I'll just have to, figure that out tomorrow. But thank you very much, everyone who joined us online. I think we've answered all the questions. There's no question on YouTube. They're all happy. And Jack, I think you're just saying goodbye. Are you, Jack? Or, as opposed to asking a question. So thank you very much, Dr. Anbinder. I will say tomorrow we're back to our Irish cooking traditions series with Chef Michael Kiernan and Harold Coulters, and we're going to be making caul cannon and apple cake, which is a kind of a tradition during Halloween at home in Ireland. And on the 27th, we've got an Irish poet and raconteur who writes in both Gaelic and English, Gabriel Fitzmaurice. He'll be live in person in the museum, but we'll live stream it as well. So we're delighted to have had you. I think you added immensely to the series, Dr. Anbinder, because sometimes this is such a sad story that it's great to see there was, the famous word, the agency of these immigrants and individuals, that lived to tell the tale and did improve their lives. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. It was a great pleasure.
Yeah, it was good seeing you virtually again.
Yes.
And thank you everyone for joining. And if you're not a member of the museum, please consider doing so. If you would like to subscribe to our YouTube channel, that would be great. There's over almost 200 talks on there now. We've been live streaming these things since COVID, so there's a load of different things that you can look at on our YouTube channel. So thank you very much, Dr. Anbinder, and good night, everybody. And we'll see you again tomorrow.